Unit 6, Land Use Controls. Learning Objectives. When you have completed this unit, you will be able to accomplish the following. Identify different types of public land use controls and their effect on property use. Explain the development of a master plan and how it affects development, control, and use of property. Define various zoning concepts and terms and the basic stages in developing a subdivision, including compliance with zoning, regulations, building codes, laws regarding sewage disposal, and the approval process. Identify the purpose of governmental regulations, such as of the Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act, building codes, laws regarding on-site septic systems, FEMA, environmental protection legislation, and ADA. Express the significance of privately imposed land use controls. Describe real estate brokers' disclosure responsibilities regarding land use controls. Key terms: aesthetic zoning, buffer zone, building code, building permit, certificate of occupancy, cluster zoning, conditional use permit, declaration of restrictive covenants, enabling act, extraterritorial jurisdictions, Federal Emergency Management Agency, flood hazard area, historic preservation zoning, Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act, lashes, master plan, nonconforming use, overlay district, plat map, police power, property report, protective covenant, restrictive covenant, spot zoning, straight piping, subdivision, variance, wetlands, zoning ordinance. Introduction. Since North Carolina was one of the original 13 English colonies, it is logical that English common law would serve as the bedrock of legal concepts embraced and adopted for use within the state. Consequently, the common law tended to favor a landowner's unfettered right to use his land without restriction. As the size of neighboring land parcels and the distance between residences continued to shrink, the land use of the adjoining parcel became more and more important. Privately regulated and enforced land use restrictions in the form of restrictive covenants began to surface in planned neighborhoods. Even when present, these private covenants seldom heeded the needs of the larger public good. The need for more comprehensive land use guidelines became obvious early in the 20th century. While high-rise tenements and early skyscrapers were becoming popular products to maximize income for real estate investors in larger American cities, neighboring property owners were protesting the loss of sunlight and air circulation. The construction of the 42-story Equitable building in the lower Manhattan area of New York City cast an alarming 7-acre shadow over the surrounding properties. This building proved to be the catalyst, in 1916, for the adoption of the first citywide comprehensive zoning resolution to restrict height and setbacks in the country. The complexity of zoning regulations have developed over the years, not only in New York City, but around the country and world. The regulation of land use is accomplished through public land use controls, private land use controls, and public ownership of land, including parks, schools, and expressways, by federal, state, and local governments. Learning objective. Identify different types of public land use controls and their effect on property use. Public land use controls. The governmental right of police power of the states is their inherent authority to create and adopt regulations necessary to protect the public health, safety, and general welfare of the citizenry. The states, in turn, allow counties, cities, and towns to make regulations in keeping with general laws. A largely urban population and the increasing demands placed on our limited natural resources have made it necessary for cities, towns, and villages to increase limitations on the private use of real estate. There are now controls over noise, air, and water pollution, as well as population density. Public land use controls include planning, zoning, subdivision regulations, building codes, and environmental protection legislation. In North Carolina, the power to restrict the use of private property to promote the public health, safety, morals, or welfare comes from police power. The General Assembly has passed enabling acts that provide the legal basis for the local cities and counties to develop long-range plans. The power to enact zoning laws is found in Chapter 160A of the North Carolina General Statutes as to municipalities, and Chapter 153A as to counties. Public land use controls include planning, zoning, subdivision regulations, and building codes. True, Restrictive covenants are laws imposed by local government authorities. False. Learning objective. Explain the development of a master plan and how it affects development, control, and use of property. The master plan. The primary method by which local governments recognize development goals is through the formulation of a comprehensive master plan, also commonly referred to as a general plan. Cities and counties develop long-term master plans for 20 years or longer to ensure that social and economic needs are balanced against environmental and aesthetic concerns. A master plan is both a statement of policies and a presentation of how those policies can be realized. As created by the city, county, or regional planning commission, a typical master plan provides for land use, including standards of population density and economic development. Public facilities, including schools, civic centers, and utilities. Circulation, including public transportation and highways. Conservation of energy and natural resources. And noise abatement. Both economic and physical surveys are essential in preparing a master plan. Countywide plans also must include the coordination of numerous civic plans and developments to ensure orderly city growth with stabilized property values. City plans are put into effect by the enactment and enforcement of zoning ordinances. The primary method by which local governments recognize development goals is zoning. False. Master plans often have the impact of destabilizing property value. False. Learning objective. Define various zoning concepts and terms in the basic stages in developing a subdivision, including compliance with zoning, regulations, building codes, laws regarding sewage disposal, and the approval process. Zoning and subdivision regulations. Zoning. The provisions of the master plan are implemented by zoning ordinances. Zoning ordinances are laws imposed by local government authorities that regulate and control the use of land and structures within designated districts or zones. Zoning regulates and affects such things as permitted uses of each parcel of land, lot sizes, types of structures, building heights, setbacks, style and appearance of structures, density, and protection of natural resources. Zoning ordinances cannot be static. They must remain flexible to meet the changing needs of society. Example: in many large cities, factories and warehouses sit empty. Some cities have begun changing the zoning ordinances for such properties to permit new residential or commercial developments in areas once zoned strictly for heavy industrial use. Coupled with tax incentives, the changes lure developers back into the cities. The resulting housing is modern, conveniently located, and affordable. Simple zoning changes can help revitalize whole neighborhoods in big cities. Zoning powers are conferred on municipal governments by North Carolina's Enabling Act through the General Assembly. There are no nationwide or statewide zoning ordinances. Zoning is local in nature. Because there is no conformity of zoning codes or definitions, it is critical for brokers to check with local municipalities before answering any questions about zoning. Zoning ordinances generally divide land use into general use classifications such as residential, commercial, industrial, and agricultural. There are usually many specific subclassifications under each general use category. Many communities now include cluster zoning and multiple use zoning. The first utilizes the clustering of residential lots in cul-de-sacs to increase open space, while the latter permits planned unit developments. In cluster zoning, a developer can provide the same number of housing units as traditional subdivision plans, but with substantially increased tracts of open space. This is accomplished by slightly reducing the sizes of the individual lots and clustering the lots around varying street plans such as cul-de-sacs. To ensure adequate control, land use areas are further divided into subclasses. Residential areas may be subdivided to provide for detached single-family dwellings, semi-detached structures containing not more than 4 dwelling units, walk-up apartments, or high-rise apartments. Some communities require the use of buffer zones, such as landscape parks and playgrounds, to separate and screen residential areas from non-residential areas. Zoning ordinances. Today, almost all cities have enacted comprehensive zoning ordinances governing the use of land located within corporate limits. North Carolina General Assembly has enacted legislation that allows a municipality to regulate development in areas adjacent to, but not within, the corporate limits. These areas outside the incorporated limits, but subject to the zoning restrictions of a municipality, are called extraterritorial jurisdictions. Population of the municipality will determine if the regulatory power extends 1 mile or up to 3 miles from the corporate limits. Zoning ordinances must not violate the rights of property owners or the various provisions of the North Carolina State Constitution. If the means used to regulate the use of property are destructive, unreasonable, arbitrary, or confiscatory, the legislation is usually considered void. Tests commonly applied in determining the validity of ordinances require that the power be exercised in a reasonable manner, the provisions be clear and specific, the ordinance be free from discrimination, the ordinance promote public health, safety, and general welfare under the police power concept, and the ordinance apply to all property in a similar manner. When land is taken for public use by the government's power of eminent domain, the owner must receive fair compensation. When downzoning occurs in an area, for instance, when land zoned for residential construction is rezoned for conservation or recreational purposes only, the state is ordinarily not responsible for compensating property owners for any resulting loss of value. However, if the courts find that a taking has occurred, the downzoning will be held to be an unconstitutional attempt to use the power of eminent domain without providing fair compensation to the property owner. Zoning laws are generally enforced by requiring that building permits be obtained before property owners can build on their land. A permit will not be issued unless a proposed structure conforms to the permitted zoning, among other requirements. Legal nonconforming use. It is not unusual to find real property uses that were legally established before the adoption of the current zoning plan. This grandfathered use is referred to as a legal nonconforming use of the property. Nonconforming use can apply to the way the land is used, the type of structure that is on the property, the way the structure is used, or even the lot size itself. For instance, a small factory building may be the last one left in a neighborhood that was once industrial, but has since been zoned for residential use. The factory owner has a matter of right to continue this nonconforming, pre-existing use. Nonconforming uses are generally not permitted to continue indefinitely. Zoning statutes may prohibit the reconstruction of a building that is destroyed by fire, or otherwise dismantled if it does not conform to current zoning requirements. Generally, nonconforming use property can only be maintained, not improved nor enlarged, since the zoning authority usually desires eventual conformity by all property. Compliance with current zoning requirements may also be required upon transfer of title. A real estate broker should never guarantee the continuance of a nonconforming use after a purchase. Refer the buyer to the zoning power for verification. Illegal use. An illegal nonconforming use is one that violates the zoning laws at the time it is put into place. For example, opening a gas station in a single-family residential zone would be an illegal use. The zoning body can go to court to stop an illegal use at any time, even if the unpermitted use has been in place for an extensive period of time. To create an illegal nonconforming use is a misdemeanor. Zoning variations. Each time a master plan is created or a zoning ordinance enacted, some owners are inconvenienced and want to change the use of their property. Zoning boards of adjustment have been established in most communities to hear complaints about the effects of zoning ordinances on specific parcels of property. Petitions may be presented to the board for variances or exceptions to the zoning law. Generally, such owners may appeal for either a conditional use permit or a variance to allow a use that does not meet current zoning requirements. A conditional use permit or special use permit is provided for in the zoning laws. It is granted to a property owner who wishes to use property in a special way that is in the public interest, such as a church or hospital in a residential district. A variance may also be sought to allow a deviation from an ordinance due to unique circumstances. Under highest and best use, it is in the public interest to put land to use rather than have it lie fallow. To get a variance, the property owner must prove that there is no other reasonable use for the property, and the property owner will suffer a substantial hardship if the variance is not granted. A hardship also must not have been created by the property owner. Example: if an owner's lot is level next to a road but slopes steeply 30 feet away from the road, the zoning board may allow a variance so the owner can build closer to the road than the setback requirement allows. Otherwise, the lot could not be used. A property owner can change the zoning classification of a parcel of real estate by obtaining an amendment to the official zoning map, which is part of the original zoning ordinance for the area. The proposed amendment must be brought before a public hearing on the matter and approved by the governing body of the community. When local officials fail to grant the desired relief from zoning regulations, the unhappy property owner can appeal to the courts, which may override the local officials and even the voters. Overlay districts. An overlay district is a type of zoning that is superimposed over another type of zoning. The overlay zone can modify the use of the original zone. A common example is when an area that is zoned single-family residential is also designated as a flood zone. This means that additional restrictions and regulations are imposed on developments and improvements in that area. Two other examples of overlay districts are historic preservation and aesthetic zoning. Historic preservation zoning. The purpose of historic preservation zoning is to preserve historic buildings and sites that are irreplaceable. An owner whose property falls within a historic preservation zone may have difficulty changing or upgrading the exterior of a structure on the property. Before making material changes to a property located in a designated historic district or to individual property designated as a historic property, the owner must obtain a certificate of appropriateness from the appropriate regulatory entity. This certificate confirms that the local Historic Preservation Commission or other appropriate entity has approved of the changes to be made to the property. Aesthetic zoning. In North Carolina, an area can be zoned strictly for aesthetic or appearance considerations. Therefore, a property's value can be increased or decreased for the public good of an aesthetically pleasing neighborhood. Exterior surfaces of structures being restricted to a particular color palette or construction material would be an example of aesthetic zoning. Spot zoning. When a particular property or group of properties is rezoned to permit a use different from the neighboring property's use, it is referred to as spot zoning. Whether spot zoning is legal or illegal in any particular case depends on whether the spot zoning is truly in the public interest rather than being for the benefit of a single property owner at the expense of neighboring property owners or the community at large. Some of the factors considered by North Carolina courts when determining the legality of spot zoning include the size of the rezoned area. Rezoning a single lot is more questionable than rezoning multiple tracts. The degree of compatibility of the different zoning with the government's adopted plans for the area. The impact of the rezoning on the landowner, neighboring landowners, and the surrounding community, and the degree of difference between the zoning of the surrounding area and the new zoning for the tract in question. Spot zoning. X is zoned single-family residential, which does not fit in with the uses made of other surrounding properties, all of which are zoned for commercial or industrial use. This chart shows that the owners of X should probably legally fight the classification of their property as single-family residential. The community has singled them out for treatment that is unconstitutional. Broker's duty to disclose zoning. Brokers' responsibilities concerning knowledge of land use controls vary. Brokers working with urban properties, both commercial and residential, usually have more responsibilities and require more knowledge than brokers working in more rural areas where there are usually fewer zoning classifications or restrictions. Residential brokers may require more knowledge of subdivision regulations, street disclosure laws, and protective covenants than commercial brokers, who may require more knowledge about rezoning, variances, and special use permits. Brokers should be able to recognize situations such as mixed use and property alterations where a closer check of zoning may be necessary. A broker should never make assumptions about the current or future zoning of a property on behalf of a client or customer. Purchasers and tenants are strongly encouraged to verify with the regulatory power any property use that is material to their desire for the property in question. Proper disclosure of zoning and protective covenants should be routinely made before the buyer, tenant signs an offer to purchase, lease. A listing broker should acquire copies of any deed restrictions and protective covenants at the time of taking the listing. Watch the video to learn more about nonconforming use. Subdivision regulations. There is no uniform planning and land development legislation that affects the entire country. Laws governing subdividing and land planning are controlled by the state and by local governing bodies of the county, city, town, or village where the land is located. Local regulations are by no means uniform, but reflect customs and local climate, health, and hazardous conditions. Despite the local nature of land use laws, rules, and regulations developed by government agencies such as the Federal Housing Administration have provided certain minimum standards that have served as usable guides. A large number of local governments have established higher standards for subdividers of land under their jurisdiction. In North Carolina, state law defines the term subdivision as all divisions of a tract or parcel of land into 2 or more lots, building sites, or other divisions for the purpose of sale or building development, and includes all division of land involving the dedication of a new street or a change in existing streets. There are a few exceptions to this definition of subdivision. The following 2 types of parcels are not considered subdivisions. A division of land if each parcel has more than 10 acres with no street right-of-way dedication, and a division of land no larger than 2 acres into no more than 3 lots with no street right-of-way dedication involved, when the parcel is owned by a single entity. Although an approved preliminary plat of subdivision of land prior to public sale for residential or commercial use is required, land planning precedes the actual subdividing process. A land development plan must comply with the overall master plan adopted by the county, city, town, or village. The basic city plan and zoning requirements are not inflexible, but long, expensive hearings are usually required before alterations can be authorized. Approval of the subdivision plat map by local authorities is, however, a necessary step before recording. Actual transfer of title cannot occur until the final plat has been recorded. Most cities, villages, and other areas that are incorporated under state laws have planning commissions. Depending on how the particular group is organized, such a committee or commission may have only an advisory status to the council or trustees of the community. In other instances, the commission may have authority to approve or disapprove plans. Communities establish strict criteria before approving new subdivisions. Frequent requirements are dedication of land for streets, schools, and parks, assurance by bonding that sewer and street costs will be paid or that such improvements will be completed before construction begins, and compliance with zoning ordinances governing use and lot size, along with fire and safety ordinances. Because of the fear that they may pollute streams, rivers, lakes, and underground water sources, septic tank systems are no longer authorized in many areas, and an environmentally approved sewage disposal arrangement must be included in a land development plan. The shortage of water has caused great concern, and local authorities usually require that land planners submit information on how they intend to satisfy sewage disposal and water supply requirements. Development and septic tank installation may first require a soil evaluation test of the soil's absorption and drainage capacities. Frequently, a planner will also have to submit an environmental impact report. Subdivision process. The process of subdivision normally involves 3 distinct stages of development: the initial planning stage, the final planning stage, and the disposition, or startup. During the initial planning stage, the subdivider seeks out raw land in a suitable area. Once the land is located, the property is analyzed for its highest and best use, and preliminary subdivision plans are drawn up accordingly. Close contact is initiated between the subdivider and local planning and zoning officials. If the project requires zoning variances, negotiations for these begin. The subdivider also locates financial backers and initiates marketing strategies. The final planning stage is basically a follow-up of the initial stage. Final plans are prepared, approval is sought from local officials, permanent financing is obtained, the land is purchased, final budgets are prepared, and marketing programs are designed. The disposition or startup carries the subdividing process to a conclusion. Subdivision plans are recorded with local officials, and streets, sewers, and utilities are installed. Buildings, open parks, and recreational areas are constructed and landscaped if they are part of the subdivision plan. Marketing programs are then initiated, and title to the individual parcels of subdivided land is transferred as the lots are sold. However, subsection states, the provisions of this section do not prohibit an owner or its agent from entering into contracts to sell or lease by reference to an approved preliminary plat for which a final plat has not yet been properly approved under the subdivision regulation or recorded with the Register of Deeds, provided the contract does all of the following. Incorporates as an attachment a copy of the preliminary plat referenced in the contract and obligates the owner to deliver to the buyer a copy of the recorded plat prior to closing. And conveyance plainly and conspicuously notifies the prospective buyer or lessee that a final subdivision plat has not been approved or recorded at the time of the contract, that no governmental body will incur any obligation to the prospective buyer or lessee with respect to the approval of the final subdivision plat, that changes between the preliminary and final plats are possible, and that the contract or lease may be terminated without breach by the buyer or lessee if the final recorded plat differs in any material respect from the preliminary plat. Provides that if the approved and recorded final plat does not differ in any material respect from the plat referred to in the contract, the buyer or lessee may not be required by the seller or lessor to close any earlier than 5 days after the delivery of a copy of the final recorded plat. Provides that if the approved and recorded final plat differs in any material respect from the preliminary plat referred to in the contract, the buyer or lessee may not be required by the seller or lessor to close any earlier than 15 days after the delivery of the final recorded plat, during which 15-day period the buyer or lessee may terminate the contract without breach or any further obligation, and may receive a refund of all earnest money or prepaid purchase price. Subdivision Streets Disclosure Law. A developer of most new subdivisions must have streets approved, based on construction standards set by the North Carolina Department of Transportation, and must declare the streets to be for public or private use. Developers and their brokers must disclose to buyers whether new subdivision streets will be public or private prior to selling or conveying the lot, pursuant to North Carolina disclosure laws. This mandated written disclosure, which requires a signature from the buyer, must explain the consequences and responsibilities of a private street, disclose the party or parties responsible for construction and maintenance of the street, and disclose that the street will not be constructed to the minimum standard required of publicly maintained streets. Regardless of the age of the subdivision, real estate brokers should determine if the streets are public or private before making any statements to that effect. It is worth noting that, just because streets have been dedicated for public use and approved by the North Carolina Department of Transportation, does not mean that the DOT has assumed responsibility for maintenance of the streets. There is usually a minimum population requirement prior to state adoption. Street maintenance issues are on the rise as many subdivisions with private streets that were built during the real estate boom of the 1990s and 2000s have begun to deteriorate to the point that maintenance is needed. An inquiry frequently reveals that the streets are actually private, and the unsuspecting property owners are responsible for expensive street maintenance. It may be helpful to review the Streets Disclosure Statute in full. SS 136-102.6. Compliance of subdivision streets with minimum standards of the Board of Transportation required of developers. The owner of a tract or parcel of land which is subdivided from and after October 1, 1975, into 2 or more lots, building sites, or other divisions for sale or building development for residential purposes, where such subdivision includes a new street or the changing of an existing street, shall record a map or plat of the subdivision with the Register of Deeds of the county in which the land is located. The map or plat shall be recorded prior to any conveyance of a portion of said land, by reference to said map or plat. The right-of-way of any new street or change in an existing street shall be delineated upon the map or plat with particularity, and such streets shall be designated to be either public or private. Any street designated on the plat or map as public shall be conclusively presumed to be an offer of dedication to the public of such street. The right-of-way and design of streets designated as public shall be in accordance with the minimum right-of-way and construction standards established by the Board of Transportation for acceptance on the state highway system. If a municipal or county subdivision control ordinance is in effect in the area proposed for subdivision, the map or plat required by this section shall not be recorded by the Register of Deeds until after it has received final plat approval by the municipality or county, and until after it has received a certificate of approval by the Division of Highways as herein provided as to those streets regulated in subsection. The certificate of approval may be issued by a district engineer of the Division of Highways of the Department of Transportation. The right-of-way and construction plans for such public streets and residential subdivisions, including plans for street drainage, shall be submitted to the Division of Highways for review and approval prior to the recording of the subdivision plat in the office of the Register of Deeds. The plat or map required by this section shall not be recorded by the Register of Deeds without a certification pursuant to GS 47-30.2 and, if determined to be necessary, by the review officer. A certificate of approval by the Division of Highways of the plans for the public street as being in accordance with the minimum standards of the Board of Transportation for acceptance of the subdivision street on the state highway system for maintenance. The review officer shall not certify a map or plat subject to this section unless the new streets or changes in existing streets are designated either public or private. The certificate of approval shall not be deemed an acceptance of the dedication of the streets on the subdivision plat or map. Final acceptance by the Division of Highways of the public streets and placing them on the state highway system for maintenance shall be conclusive proof that the streets have been constructed according to the minimum standards of the Board of Transportation. No person or firm shall place or erect any utility in, over, or upon the existing or proposed right-of-way of any street in a subdivision to which this section applies, except in accordance with the Division of Highways policies and procedures for accommodating utilities on highway rights-of-way until the Division of Highways has given written approval of the location of such utilities. Written approval may be in the form of exchange of correspondence until such times as it is requested to add the street or streets to the state system, at which time an encroachment agreement furnished by the Division of Highways must be executed between the owner of the utility and the Division of Highways. The right of any utility placed or located on a proposed or existing subdivision public street right-of-way shall be subordinate to the street right-of-way, and the utility shall be subject to regulation by the Department of Transportation. Utilities are defined as electric power, telephone, television, telegraph, water, sewage, gas, oil, petroleum products, steam, chemicals, drainage, irrigation, and similar lines. Any utility installed in a subdivision street not in accordance with the Division of Highways GS 136-102.6 page 2 accommodation policy, and without prior approval by the Division of Highways, shall be removed or relocated at no expense to the Division of Highways. Prior to entering any agreement or any conveyance with any prospective buyer, the developer and seller shall prepare and sign, and the buyer of the subject real estate shall receive and sign an acknowledgment of receipt of a separate instrument known as the Subdivision Streets Disclosure Statement. Said disclosure statement shall fully and completely disclose the status of the street upon which the house or lot fronts. If the street is designated by the developer and seller as a public street, the developer and seller shall certify that the right-of-way and design of the street has been approved by the Division of Highways, and that the street has been or will be constructed by the developer and seller in accordance with the standards for subdivision streets adopted by the Board of Transportation for acceptance on the highway system. If the street is designated by the developer and seller as a private street, the developer and seller shall include in the disclosure statement an explanation of the consequences and responsibility as to maintenance of a private street, and shall fully and accurately disclose the party or parties upon whom responsibility for construction and maintenance of such street or streets shall rest, and shall further disclose that the street or streets will not be constructed to minimum standards, sufficient to allow their inclusion on the state highway system for maintenance. The disclosure statement shall contain a duplicate original which shall be given to the buyer. Written acknowledgment of receipt of the disclosure statement by the buyer shall be conclusive proof of the delivery thereof. The provisions of this section shall apply to all subdivisions located outside municipal corporate limits. As to subdivisions inside municipalities, this section shall apply to all proposed streets or changes in existing streets on the state highway system as shown on the comprehensive plan for the future development of the street system made pursuant to GS 136-66.2 and in effect at the date of approval of the map or plat. The provisions of this section shall not apply to any subdivision that consists only of lots located on Lakes Hickory, Norman, Mountain Island, and Wiley, which are lakes formed by the Catawba River, which lots are leased upon October 1st, 1975. No roads in any such subdivision shall be added to the state-maintained road system without first having been brought up to standards established by the Board of Transportation for inclusion of roads in the system, without expense to the state. Prior to entering any agreement or any conveyance with any prospective buyer of a lot in any such subdivision, the seller shall prepare and sign, and the buyer shall receive and sign an acknowledgment of receipt of a statement fully and completely disclosing the status of and the responsibility for construction and maintenance of the road upon which such lot is located. The purpose of this section is to ensure that new subdivision streets described herein to be dedicated to the public will comply with the state standards for placing subdivision streets on the state highway system for maintenance, or that full and accurate disclosure of the responsibility for construction and maintenance of private streets be made. This section shall be construed and applied in a manner which shall not inhibit the ability of public utilities to satisfy service requirements of subdivisions to which this section applies. The Division of Highways and District Engineers of the Division of Highways of the Department of Transportation shall issue a certificate of approval for any subdivision affected by a transportation corridor official map established by the Board of Transportation only if the subdivision conforms to Article 2E of this chapter or conforms to any variance issued in accordance with that article. GS 136-102.6 page 3. A willful violation of any of the provisions of this section shall be a Class 1 misdemeanor. In practice, the question of the public or private status of the subdivision streets is very important to buyers, and it is very possible that the buyers do not even know to inquire about the status of the streets. If the property is in a new subdivision, the developer must voluntarily disclose the status of subdivision streets as mandated by state law. A subsequent property owner does not have to make such disclosure upon the resale of the property. Consequently, any prudent broker working with a buyer would be well advised to recommend that the buyer inquire about the status of the subdivision streets. If the inquiry reveals that the streets are public, further inquiry should be made to determine if the state has assumed responsibility for street maintenance. If the inquiry reveals that the streets are private, further inquiry should be made to determine exactly who is responsible for maintenance. Of course, if any real estate broker involved in a house sale has actual knowledge that subdivision streets where the house is located are private, that broker absolutely must disclose this material fact to any prospective buyer. Real estate brokers should be well aware of the needed verification of approved subdivisions, especially in regards to selling recently subdivided lots. Before selling or listing lots in newly subdivided land, a broker should check with the Register of Deeds office in the county where the lot is located to ensure the plat has been properly recorded. Approval must be granted by the proper county agency before recordation can take place. North Carolina now allows the acceptance of monies and contracts on subdivision parcels once the preliminary plat has been approved. However, if there are any material changes from the preliminary to the final plat map, a buyer is allowed to cancel any existing contract and receive a refund of all monies. A broker who closes a sale on a lot before final approval of the subdivision is granted and recorded may be subject to a civil lawsuit, or may be criminally prosecuted as well as face disciplinary action by the North Carolina Real Estate Commission. You can refer to the NCREC Residential Subdivisions and Planned Communisites brochure to learn more about subdivision regulations. Plat of subdivision. The subdivider's completed plat of subdivision, a map of the development indicating the location and boundaries of individual properties, must contain all necessary approvals of public officials and must be recorded in the county where the land is located. Once the plat is recorded, each lot then has a legal description that is used to convey the property. The plat will be the basis for future conveyance, so the subdivided land should be measured carefully, with all lot sizes and streets noted by the surveyor and entered accurately on the document. Survey monuments should be established, and measurements should be made from these monuments, with the location of all lots carefully marked. As noted previously, brokers engaged to sell subdivided land should be certain that the subdivision has been approved by the appropriate government body. Covenants and restrictions. Deed restrictions, discussed in more detail later, are usually originated and recorded by a subdivider as a means of controlling and maintaining the desirable quality and character of the subdivision. These restrictions can be included in the subdivision plat, or they may be set forth in a separate recorded instrument, commonly referred to as a declaration of restrictions. Deed restrictions may include the size of structures that can be built, the cost, often the minimum cost, of structures that can be built, the number of structures that can be built, or even architectural styles, fence heights, setbacks, or outbuildings that can be built on the land. Almost anything that is not illegal can be set forth in the restrictive covenants. FHA standards. FHA minimum standards have been established for residential area subdivisions that are to be submitted for approval for FHA loan insurance. The primary minimum standards established by the FHA deal with the actual development and infrastructure of the subdivision. FHA standards also apply to building construction. Since 1986, in recognition of the more stringent local codes in effect, the FHA has allowed local building codes to serve as the standards. Exceptions generally include site condition standards, thermal standards, and certain other material standards. Non-conforming use refers to properties that are rezoned to permit use different from neighboring properties. False. Once a completed structure has been inspected and found satisfactory, a building inspector will issue a certificate of reasonable value. False. Learning objective. Identify the purpose of governmental regulations, such as of the Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act, building codes, laws regarding on-site septic systems, FEMA, environmental protection legislation, and ADA. Governmental regulations. To protect consumers from fraudulent and overenthusiastic sales promotions in interstate land sales, Congress passed the Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act in 1968. The law requires those engaged in the interstate sale or leasing of subdivision lots to file a statement of record and register the details of the land with HUD. The Act exempts the sale of lots in a subdivision containing fewer than 25 lots. Interstate sales or leasing activities include out-of-state mailers, newspaper ads, television advertising directed to out-of-state buyers, and out-of-state telephone solicitation. Brokers involved in interstate selling of lots across state lines that come under this act should seek legal advice to ensure full compliance. Prior to signing a purchase agreement or lease, the developer must furnish prospective buyers or lessees with a property report containing all essential information about the property, such as distance over paved roads to nearby communities, number of homes currently occupied, soil conditions affecting foundations and septic systems, type of title a buyer receives, and existence of liens. The Act provides a number of exemptions. For instance, it does not apply to subdivisions consisting of fewer than 25 lots or to those in which each lot is 20 acres or more. Lots offered for sale solely to developers also are exempt from the Act's requirements, as are lots on which buildings exist or where a seller is obligated to construct a building within 2 years. Failure to provide the property report prior to contract formation may give the consumer grounds to void the contract. If the seller misrepresents the property in any sales promotion, anyone induced to purchase a lot by the promotion can sue the seller for civil damages. Failure to comply with the law also may subject a seller to criminal penalties of fines and imprisonment. Building codes. North Carolina has enacted a series of statewide building codes containing requirements as to construction standards, and the primary purpose is safety. Most cities, towns, and counties have enacted ordinances that enforce these minimum construction standards that must be met when repairing or erecting buildings. This enforcement is through the local building inspectors certified by the North Carolina Department of Insurance. These building codes set the requirements for kinds of materials, sanitary equipment, electrical wiring, fire prevention standards, and the like. Most communities require the issuance of a building permit by the city clerk or another official before a person can build a new structure or alter or repair an existing building on property within the municipality. The permit requirement allows officials to verify compliance with building codes and zoning ordinances as they examine the plans and inspect the work. Once the completed structure has been inspected and found satisfactory, the building inspector issues a certificate of occupancy. Not securing a building permit can make the property uninsurable for hazard insurance purposes until the oversight has been rectified. Some municipalities will allow retroactive approval of permits. Some will require total removal of the improvement or repair. Unpermitted space may be included in heated living square footage quoted by real estate brokers, though the lack of a necessary permit must be disclosed as a material fact to all parties. If the construction violates a private deed restriction, the issuance of a building permit will not cure this violation. A building permit is merely evidence of the applicant's compliance with municipal regulations. On-site septic systems. North Carolina state law requires that every residence and place of public assembly have an approved system for sewage disposal. Approved systems include municipal systems, community systems, and on-site systems. If a property is hooked up to a municipal system or community system, water and/or sewer service is provided for a fee to a property by a third party who controls the delivery mechanisms. If there is no outside provider, then the property must supply its own water and sewage disposal to be usable. Not all properties will support an on-site septic system. A property that cannot be connected to municipal or community systems will have severely limited use, and thus reduced value. Thus, the question of sewage disposal is a material fact that all brokers should research. A properly designed septic system is designed to handle a specific amount of wastewater. Septic drain fields, also called leach fields or leach drains, are used to remove contaminants and impurities from the liquid that emerges from the septic tank. A complete septic system includes a septic tank, a septic drain field, and associated piping. On-site systems vary greatly in form and price, and who regulates or approves the system. Under state law, county health departments are responsible for approving underground systems, whether a conventional subsurface system with a tank and drainage field, or the more complicated low-pressure pump system. Systems that discharge above the ground, such as spray irrigation systems, or systems that discharge into streams or waterways, are regulated by the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. Off-site and community systems that serve more than one lot also are regulated at the state level. If a buyer intends to purchase a property where an on-site septic system is required, the purchaser should request a soil suitability test or obtain one from the seller. Buyer's agents should advise their buyer clients to have a soil suitability test performed. To request testing, a person files an application with the county health department explaining the proposed use of the property. A registered sanitarian from the health department will inspect the lot, tract, gather soil samples from different places on the parcel, and rate the various samples as either suitable, provisionally suitable, or unsuitable for an underground septic system. If the sanitarian finds that there is sufficient suitable or provisionally suitable soil for an on-site system, and enough land for a repair area, then an improvements permit will be issued. Once issued, the permit is valid for a specified period of time, even if the standards later change, so long as the property features or its proposed uses have not changed. The period of time the permit is valid varies from county to county. The septic permit will set a capacity limit for the system, typically specifying the number of bedrooms for a residence, or the maximum number of rooms, or some other measure for a non-residential structure. The permit may prohibit the use of an automatic dishwasher, garbage disposal, or other use that might overload the system. The permit also may include a map depicting the best location for the system and repair area. If the property's water source is a well, then no component of the septic system may be within 100 feet of any well serving either the subject property or adjoining properties. An owner selling unimproved land should consider having a soil suitability test prior to listing the property. If the tract is suitable for an on-site septic system, marketability of the property may be enhanced by applying for and obtaining a permit. Since the permit is valid for a specified period and it resolves the septic question before it becomes an issue. If the seller learns that the tract is not suitable for any on-site system, the seller may or may not choose to disclose this fact to prospective purchasers. It may also influence the seller's decision as to whether the seller wishes to sell now or wait until community or municipal septic service becomes available. However, if a broker learns that a tract is not suitable for an on-site system, that broker is required to disclose that material fact to all prospective purchasers. Brokers should also assist property owners and prospective purchasers in determining what kind of septic system is on the premises, as well as the location and functionality of the system. It is not easy to find a septic tank. The first thing to do is contact the local health zoning office to see if it has a plan on record. Even if a drawing exists, it may not match exactly what is in the ground. Determining who installed the system may also be helpful. Brokers should provide guidance as to where location information can be found regarding the location of the septic tank. An inspection of a septic system may find that the tank needs to be cleaned or that it has failed. Septic drain fields can also fail, usually due to a drain field become clogged and impermeable. Consumers should be made aware that drain field or septic tank problems can result in messy cleanups, inconvenient smells and odor, and possibly costly repairs. Note that it is becoming more common for municipalities to mandate that a location on the property be identified and reserved for a septic repair field in the event of a future system failure. The location of the current septic system and any mandated repair field are usually noted on a survey. Since construction is generally prohibited on the repair field location, this information may be material to a buyer who wishes to install a pool or outbuilding after purchase. Rather than incurring the expense of a property sewage disposal, individuals might attempt to use illegal straight piping. Straight piping is illegal, but there still are parts of North Carolina where it occurs. Straight piping is where wastewater is discharged directly into the yard or into a nearby creek or stream, rather than into any approved treatment system. Straight piping is illegal because state law requires that any person owning or controlling a residence, place of business, or place of public assembly must discharge all wastewater directly to an approved wastewater system for that specific use. Wastewater includes gray water and black water, which is sewage. The existence of straight piping is a material fact and must be disclosed by a broker to everyone, owner, buyers, tenants, and lenders, if the broker knows or reasonably should know about it. Flood hazard regulations and insurance. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has designated many areas bordering on rivers and streams as flood hazard areas, which are subject to federal regulations concerning improvements in construction in those areas. FEMA produces maps that designate these flood hazard areas, and flood insurance is required under the National Flood Insurance Program if a federally related mortgage loan is to be used for properties within those areas. The lender will insist on appropriate flood insurance, which the buyer can purchase through most regular insurance companies that sell homeowners policies. The standard homeowners policies do not cover flood damage. Flood insurance is a separate policy from the federally operated NFIP but is brokered through local insurance companies. Land located in these flood hazard areas is subject to restrictions in terms of location, types of improvements, and elevations of the improvements. Real estate brokers should inform any potential buyers of possible flood areas and have them review the latest version of the flood maps compiled by the Army Corps of Engineers. Highway access restrictions. Access to a public road or street is important to any buyer, and the broker should make sure that public road access is available. If any government entity takes away road access, the owner must be compensated under eminent domain. If there is any planned construction of new highways, freeways, loop roads, etc., real estate brokers are expected to be aware of this and make full disclosure to any potential customer or client. Changes in road access have a great impact on value and usability of the property. Failure of a real estate broker to properly disclose material facts about road access could lead to disciplinary action by the North Carolina Real Estate Commission. In practice, the subject of city planning, zoning, and restriction of the use of real estate is extremely technical, and interpretation of the law is not altogether clear. Real estate brokers should never offer advice on whether a particular use will be allowed or whether a variance or special use permit will be granted. Questions concerning any of these subjects in relation to real estate transactions should always be referred to the appropriate authority or legal counsel. Environmental protection legislation. Federal and state legislators have passed a number of environmental protection laws in an attempt to respond to the growing public concern over the improvement and preservation of America's natural resources. The various states also have responded to the environmental issue by passing a variety of local environmental protection laws regarding all forms of pollution, air, water, noise, and solid waste disposal. Many states have enacted laws that prevent builders or private individuals from considering septic tanks or other waste disposal systems in certain areas, particularly where streams, lakes, and rivers are affected. In addition to the state and federal governments, cities and counties frequently pass environmental legislation. A broker should stay informed of local environmental concerns so they may inform consumers. Wetlands. Wetlands are land areas where groundwater is at or near the surface of the ground. Wetlands are important features in the landscape that provide numerous beneficial services for people and for fish and wildlife. Some of these services or functions include protecting and improving water quality, providing fish and wildlife habitats, storing floodwaters, and maintaining surface water flow during dry periods. Wetlands are very susceptible to flooding and are subject to many federal, state, and local controls. Americans with Disabilities Act. The federal government has recently mandated that new commercial buildings and older public buildings that undergo remodeling must meet the standards of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The purpose of this legislation is to facilitate accessibility and mobility by ramp construction, safety rails, wider doors, and other accommodations. ADA does not apply to residential housing. The purpose of the Americans with Disabilities Act is to make sure that residential properties are accessible. False. Straight piping is a legal method of wastewater disposal. False. Learning objective. Express the significance of privately imposed land use controls. Privately imposed land use controls. Private land use controls are put in place by individual developers or property owners, usually when they transfer property. When property is conveyed, a property owner can include restrictions in the deed that limit the new owner's use of the property. For example, the property may be conveyed on the condition that it is used only as a bird sanctuary. The most common examples of private land use controls are the restrictions imposed by subdivision developers. All those who purchase lots in a subdivision promise to abide by the developer's restrictions, which usually include provisions requiring regular property maintenance and restrictions on parking, fences, architectural details, etc. There is a distinction between restrictions on the grantee's right to sell and restrictions on the grantee's right to use. In general, provisions in a deed conveying a fee simple estate with restrictions on the grantee's right to sell, mortgage, or convey it are void. Such restrictions attempt to limit the basic principle of the free alienation of property. The courts consider them against public policy, and therefore unenforceable. A developer may establish limitations on the right to use land through a covenant in a deed or by reference to a separate recorded declaration, called a declaration of restrictive covenants. When a lot in that subdivision is conveyed by an owner's deed, the deed refers to the plat and declaration of restrictions, and incorporates these restrictions as limitations on the title conveyed by the deed. In this manner, the restrictive covenants are included in the deed by reference, and become binding on all grantees. Such covenants or restrictions usually relate to building type, use to which the land may be put, type of construction, height, setbacks, and square footage, and possibly cost. Private use restrictions are used primarily to protect property values and need not pass the test of promoting the public welfare, the test that public use restrictions must pass. In practice, the term restrictive covenant is being replaced by the term protective covenant. Both have essentially the same meaning, which is defined by the North Carolina Real Estate Commission as follows. Protective covenants are enforceable conditions that restrict the manner in which an owner may use her property. The term protective covenant is a more modern term and better implies the intended use, which is to protect owners from uses that may have an adverse effect on value or enjoyment. Use restrictions usually are considered valid if they are reasonable, and are for the benefit of all property owners in the subdivision. However, if such restrictions are so broad in their terms that they prevent the free transfer of property, they may not be enforceable. If any restrictive covenant or condition is considered ineffective by a court, the property is freed from the invalid covenant or condition. Note that deed restrictions can be more restrictive on an owner's use than zoning ordinances. When zoning and covenants are in conflict, the more restrictive of the two takes precedence. Generally, a subdivision developer will transfer the covenant enforcement rights to an established homeowners association at some predetermined time. Subdivision restrictions give the HOA and each individual lot owner the right to apply to the court for an injunction or legal action to prevent a neighboring lot owner from violating the recorded restrictions. If granted, the court injunction directs the violator to stop or remove the violation on penalty of being in contempt of court. The court retains the power to punish the violator for failure to obey the court order. If adjoining lot owners stand idle while a violation is being committed, they can lose the right to petition for injunctive relief by their inaction. The court might claim their right was lost through lashes, that is, loss of a right through undue delay or failure to assert it. As noted, enforcement of the covenants is not enforced by public official or agencies. They are enforced by public law. Remember, when covenants differ from zoning regulations on a particular matter, the more restrictive of the two will control. A subdivision developer will transfer the covenant enforcement rights to an established owners association at a predetermined time. True, deed restrictions can be more restrictive on an owner's use than zoning ordinances. True, learning objective. Describe real estate brokers' disclosure responsibilities regarding land use controls. Responsibilities of real estate brokers. When a broker knows, or should have known, that the property in question is subject to protective covenants, there are certain obligations that the broker has to the prospective buyer. The broker should inform the buyer that since the property might be subject to private use restrictions, the buyer should obtain and carefully read a copy of the most recent version of the covenants before making an offer on the property. The NCBA, NCOR2T offer to purchase and contract suggests that the purchaser should review restrictive covenants, if any, plus any governing documents for the subdivision or any established owners association, as part of the buyer's due diligence. If the property is subject to regulation by an owners association, it is recommended that buyer review the completed residential property and owners association disclosure statement provided by seller prior to signing this offer. It is also recommended that the buyer determine if the owners association charges fees for confirming owners association information and restrictive covenant compliance. Under the North Carolina Real Estate License Law, a licensee has a duty to avoid any misrepresentation regarding permitted land use, to recognize potential land use problems, and an affirmative duty to discover and disclose any such problems. A broker must avoid any representation about a property's zoning or permitted land uses without verifying the property's zoning, and, if appropriate, flood hazard area maps and any restrictive covenants affecting the property. A broker is expected to be able to recognize red flag situations regarding land use issues, advise the parties involved of the potential problem, and recommend that the interested parties verify the permitted land uses. Recognizing and taking appropriate action with regard to potential problems with restrictive covenants is particularly important. A broker is expected to be able to recognize patent signs of flooding on a property, or when a property's location may make it susceptible to flooding. A broker should assist the parties with locating and reviewing the FEMA maps or checking with the local planning office to determine if there is any potential flooding problem. A broker is expected to be aware of planned major highway or public transportation changes in the area where the agent works and to disclose such information when appropriate. Although a prudent broker should always volunteer general knowledge of the possible existence of land use restrictions, there are some situations that would require a broker to actively disclose and notify the buyer of possible problems. A broker is strongly cautioned to refrain from stating whether or not a particular use of the property will be allowed or if a certain act will be in violation of the covenants. Also, making assumptions about allowed activities or uses based on what other property owners have done is a recipe for a liability suit. Some aberrant uses may have been legally grandfathered in, and some may be illegal violations of the current covenant. Always have the consumer consult an attorney if there is any uncertainty about a proposed land use. Government ownership. Over the years, the government's general policy has been to encourage private ownership of land. A certain amount of land is owned by the government for such uses as municipal buildings, state legislative houses, schools, and military stations. Such direct public ownership is a means of land control. Publicly owned streets and highways serve a necessary function for the entire population. Public land is often used for recreational purposes as well. National and state parks and forest preserves create areas for public use and recreation and at the same time help to conserve our natural resources. At present, the federal government owns approximately 775 million acres of land, nearly 1/3 of the total area of the United States. At times, the federal government has held title to as much as 80% of the nation's total land area. A broker is expected to recognize obvious signs of flooding on a property, or when a property's location may make it susceptible to flooding. True, a broker can assume that a use is lawful based on what the current property owner is doing. False. Key point review. The police power of the state is its authority to create regulations to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. State enabling acts allow the power to enact laws authorized by the state's police power to be passed down to municipalities and other local governing authorities. Public land use is controlled and regulated through public restrictions, planning, zoning, building codes, subdivision plans, and direct ownership of land by federal, state, and local governments. A master plan created by a local government usually covers land use, movement of people and goods, community facilities and utilities, energy and natural resource conservation, and noise abatement. Zoning ordinances are local laws implementing the land uses designated in the comprehensive plan, and typically cover items such as permitted uses, lot sizes, types of structures, building heights, setbacks, style and appearance of structures, density, and protection of natural resources. Such regulations must be exercised in a reasonable manner. clear and specific, non-discriminatory, and applicable to all property in a similar manner. Zoning classifies property by uses and types, such as commercial, industrial, residential, agricultural, and extraterritorial jurisdictions. Zoning is enforced through the use of permits, and an individual case may be considered by a zoning hearing board, which may decide to allow a non-conforming use to continue, grant a variance from a zoning ordinance to permit a prohibited land use to avoid undue hardship, grant a conditional use permit, or superimpose additional zoning requirements through the use of overlay districts, such as historic preservation zoning or aesthetic zoning. Spot zoning is usually illegal and must be discontinued once discovered. Brokers have a duty to disclose zoning, which is a material fact. Building codes require permits for new construction and remodeling of or additions to existing construction. A certificate of occupancy is issued upon satisfactory completion of work for which the building permit was issued. Subdivision and land development ordinances may be created by the state or made part of a local government's comprehensive plan. These ordinances usually include the following: subdividers who buy undeveloped acreage and divide it into smaller lots for sale to individuals or developers. Developers who improve the land, construct homes or other buildings, and sell them. Plat map, which shows geographic boundaries of separate land parcels, usually by showing blocks of land divided into individual lots. Subdivision plan, which describes subdivision features and compliance with zoning and other laws, including utility easements and density zoning. Private land use controls, such as restrictive covenants, which are placed in deeds to all property owners in a subdivision and cannot impose an illegal covenant or condition and may be enforced by injunction against property owner in violation of covenant or restriction. If in conflict with local zoning, the more restrictive controls prevail. The Federal Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act regulates the interstate sale of unimproved lots in subdivisions of 25 or more lots of less than 20 acres each. The law does not apply to subdivisions sold solely to developers. Brokers are responsible for disclosing whether streets are public or privately maintained. Any restrictions about highway accessibility should also be disclosed. The broker should disclose if the property is in a FEMA flood hazard area or if there are any known environmental concerns. Buyers should determine a property's sewage disposal system and should be encouraged to obtain a soil suitability test for unimproved land. Owners must obtain a permit to install an on-site septic system. The permit is valid for a specified period and may limit location of system or uses that might overload the system. Brokers should obtain a septic permit to verify capacity of a septic system or any system restrictions. The permit is available through county health departments. The permit will describe the capacity of the system by indicating the permissible number of bedrooms. The maximum occupancy is 2 persons per bedroom. Brokers are subject to disciplinary action for any misrepresentation of occupancy limits for property served by an on-site septic system. Straight piping as a waste disposal system is illegal and its presence a material fact. Wetlands are a land area where groundwater is at or near the surface of the ground. Wetlands are very susceptible to flooding and subject to many federal, state, and local controls.